privilege to moderate. Let me stand for a moment. I understand why everybody's standing. You can't hear me? No. Can't hear me. There. It's on now. Can you hear me now? Okay. I now understand why everyone was standing before, because these chairs are so low that you feel like you're going to sleep. So in the this morning's first panel, I think we got a very, very fascinating window into the drivers of change in global supply chains. This session follows. The focus is much more on how firms are responding and or anticipating those changes, and very much through how they manage risk, how they pick the sweet spot between speed, flexibility, cost, and how they're managing change at the firm level. Delighted to have a great panel. We have Carlos Gordon, Lego professor from IMD, supply chain specialist. We have Charlie Fine, professor from MIT Sloan. We have Hao Li, professor from Stanford, so I think we're well represented in the academic world. We have Margie Yang, who's the CEO of the Eskel Group, who I believe runs one of the longest vertically integrated supply chains in the world. So that gives us a great start. I'm going to begin this in reverse alphabetical order. What I'd like to do is let each one make an opening statement. I hope we'll get in about 4 waves, because I know that you have lots of questions, well, a lot of discussion, so we'll have one wave kind of across the panel. Then we'll collect 3 or 4 questions, allow the panel to process those, then do another wave, and if we're really lucky, we'll make 4 waves of back and forth, so it'll be very interactive. So, Margie?
Thank you. I thought you were going to say that I'm the specimen woman and actual manufacturer. So, well, I saw the PowerPoint that was sent out, and so I'm going to start with Stan Shi's smiley curve, and where most of us would put China in the middle of the global supply chain, being the factory of the world. People attribute China's dominance in manufacturing to its abundant supply of low-cost labor. And lately, it has been very fashionable to say that because of rising labor costs, China's manufacturing sector is losing its competitiveness to other low labor cost countries such as Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and the latest favorite is, of course, Burma or Myanmar. At Eskel, we are in the labor-intensive textile and apparel sector with over 2/3 of our workforce in China. And people often ask us, when are you moving out of China? Well, we adopt the contrarian position that we continue to invest in China and have no plans to move out, because we, in fact, believe that China's competitiveness is only beginning to show its real strength. What is critically missing in the conventional wisdom is productivity. There is a lot of room for China's textile and apparel industry, as well as other manufacturing industries that are labor intensive, to continuously raise productivity, thereby digesting the higher labor cost. The principle is simple. And the key defining factor here is for competitiveness is really productivity, is unit labor cost. Despite China's success in manufacturing, when you have a really good labor force, the managers get a little bit lazy. So I would not claim that all the management skills that I learned and all the technology that I had the benefit to be exposed to has been used in our industry, which leaves a lot of opportunities for improvement. Now, it's like a fat person wanting to lose weight is a lot easier than a thin person trying to lose weight. So, take for example, the compensation system in apparel sector. It's still very much based on what Frederick Taylor thought of 100 years ago, when people were moving from rural area to urban area. So you'll notice that in a lot of the garment factories, they still pay people for showing up, because during those days, they're trying to train the workers to have that discipline. Today, why don't we have give them incentive for completing work on time and not having to go on overtime. You must have heard that every garment factory has overtime incentive. So there itself is already a lot of room for improvement. Imagine the productivity gain possible with the application of information technology and now mobile computing, social media, unlimited amount of potential there. Of course, the adoption of modern management is not automatic. So there has to be a lot of work that we as managers have to do. And we should start with changing the frontline supervisors. Very often, supervisors are chosen because they are good sewers. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily good leaders and managers. Also, it is very difficult to teach, I hate to say this because 45-year-old women, this is a research, but it's very difficult to teach anyone over 45, men or women, technology. So a lot of our supervisors are in fact very good, hardworking sewers who happen to be women who did not have the benefit of having an education that allows them to have the fluency of technology. So it's very difficult to implement a lot of the technology that we're trying to put in these sewing lines. So we need to upgrade to diploma holders in supervisor level. And then, as a tradition, there's always been a lot of technical experts. And that's, they're called the masters or Kung Fu masters. This is a person who is extremely valuable, but while you're trying to, what we're trying to do is to de-skill, and so what we're trying to do is to learn from these people, learn from the Kung Fu masters, and put them, make them a lot easier. So a lot of opportunity. Can we tackle it? Yes, because China has a unique, every year there are 6 million university graduates. 10% of them are engineers. This is the opportunity, and for Escal, we have been moving around in many countries. This is the first time that we have this labor skill pool that we can draw on to totally raise, completely change the game. Years ago, we were in Singapore, and in fact, the current PM, who was then Minister of Industry, asked us to upgrade our manufacturing, change our manufacturing garment operation in Singapore. But we couldn't do it then. Now we can do it. So this is why I feel very confident that we have a lot more room. Now, as a result, that these Chinese workers with a bigger take-home pay will spend more and fueling domestic consumption, which brings me to another competitive advantage. I remember a good friend, my classmate from HBS, Philip Yeo, used to say, you give me a domestic market, I can build any industry for you. In China, we have a huge domestic market. And again, this is an advantage that we never had in any other country. So that's another opportunity. And also, when you have that domestic market, you also start to strengthen all your services, including vendor management, skills, warehousing, because you're at the market. So where we have been adding a lot of service that is at the back end, which is design, product management, product development, etc., now we can even further extend. Plus, it gives us an opportunity to go into the domestic market and sell directly. So many, many opportunities. So I'd like to stop here and just summarize again. Rising labor cost is not a bad thing. In fact, if you think about it, for the last 30 years, the whole purpose of the opening up of the Chinese economy is to have bring about economic prosperity. So now that we have reached that, it's just a matter of how to use a different skill set, a different advantage to bring the industry and hopefully can transform the industry globally so that this entry, garment industry has always been an entry-level industry, has a new future, which is that people who are in this industry will continue to gain more and more and not just lose their jobs when the place becomes more prosperous and migrate to another location. Thank you.
Thank you, Margie. Nice take on the interaction between jobs and value added that we were discussing in the previous session. And don't just look at the wage, but look at the dynamism in the production sector itself. So, yeah.
So thanks, Margie. Margie mentioned several things, and two of the points that I really like and impressed, I was impressed about is she was talking about as well, not purely a company that makes shirts. In fact, she was talking about how the customers of Esquel would look at Esquel as a company that provide many services, the vendor management services, design services, warehousing services, and that really is a very, very powerful way to add values. I think our session title is about how adding values. She also mentioned about the fact that you have to think from the perspective of like the workers or the customers in their mind and not force a particular way of doing things to them. And I think that struck a chord with me. To me, the way to add value in the supply chain is to think about what the customers really need. And instead of selling them what you already have, is think about how to package, how to create new solutions that would serve their needs well. I'll give you several examples quickly. One is Cemex. Being a cement company, the world's third largest cement company, Cemex, based in Mexico. Of course, cement is a product, and they were selling cement, but they recognized that customers need cement because they need to build houses, they need to renovate their properties. And many of them are do-it-yourself customers. And so they created solutions for the customers. They created consulting services on how to manage a construction project management, financing. So it becomes a complete solution. Netafim, the world's one of the largest drip irrigation company. So they were selling irrigation equipment to the customers. But many of the customers, like Margie said, the 45-year-old worker, here in this case are illiterate farmers. Farmers who could not even read and could not operate a computer. So how could they manage a very sophisticated irrigation equipment controlled by the computer with semiconductor valves? And so they created solutions where they would remotely manage the irrigation for the customers. So they transformed themselves from a product-based company to a service-based company. In the US, we have a company called Intuit, a very successful software companies that mix products that are financial services, tax products. But again, they recognize that what the customers need were not the software, but to use the software so that they can file their taxes, so that they can manage the finances. So they transform themselves into managed services. So you can file taxes through Intuit. You don't need to buy their product anymore. You can just register and you can give them the data and they would file the taxes for you. And today, 40% of the company's revenue came from services. Used to be 100% product-based, selling CDs, selling software packages. So this transformation from a product-based company to a solution-based company, service-based company, I think is a powerful way to add values to the overall supply chain, just like what Margie described, what Esquel has done.
Charlie. Thank you. So good afternoon, or still good morning, perhaps. So I would like to build on the previous comments and frame it in terms of innovation, that in some sense going from a product company to a service company is a form of innovation. And I think successful innovators tend to build supply chains. So from Henry Ford onward, you have a successful innovation, you build a supply chain around it. Henry Ford built his supply chains, General Motors built their supply chains, Nokia built their supply chains, Li and Feng built their supply chains. If you innovate successfully, you build on that innovation by building a supply chain. However, when the next innovator comes along with his better innovation, then you see supply chain destruction. You see the dismantling of the Ford supply chain, the General Motors supply chain, the Nokia supply chain, because somebody else came along with a better mousetrap. So we see interesting dynamics between innovation in products and services, or innovation in a business model, successful innovations leading to the construction of a supply chain, in some sense, to take advantage of that innovation, to build on your advantage, to grow your capability, oftentimes in a very integral way, in a powerful way to leverage the advantage. But it's temporary. It doesn't last forever because somebody else is going to come along with a better mousetrap. And so I think one of the features at the micro level, if you happen to be the Nokia of the day and your supply chain is being dismantled, you might say, gee, that's not a very happy outcome. But on a global level, I think we want to celebrate, in some sense, the creative destruction that comes along with, in some sense, dismantling the old supply chains and building the new ones. What's good for the economy may not be good for the individual entrepreneur, and then you get issues of, well, how do you recycle productively the human skills, the human capital, when you have the destruction of supply chains? And I think that's where, in some sense, the micro meets the macro, where we need sometimes perhaps government policies to help with the retraining, with help with the recovery periods when you have the supply chain destruction that comes with creative destruction in product and service markets. So I think we have to think deeply about the connection between supply chains and about innovation. We want to celebrate innovation. We benefit from innovation, but we have to recognize that innovation has its downsides as well, which is the need to repurpose the assets and the capabilities into new supply chains. Not always easy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move a little bit forward and go to the second part of the title, which is about risks. Why I want to talk about risk, it was in the conversation previously about that. I would say that there is, in the last 2 to 3 years, we have seen a change, a qualitative change in where companies are going. Basically, I always say, in 2008, the automotive industry in the US committed collective suicide. They went bankrupt, and the first thing that they did was to bankrupt their suppliers. So the whole chain was bankrupt. It was some comments about the unfortunate earthquake in Japan, and that started a totally new thinking in many companies. I remember a company like Philips, the first time that the whole board was meeting every week with some of the top management with one question: how many millions in sales are we losing because of the Japanese earthquake? And for the first time, companies were looking at not just the immediate suppliers, but suppliers of suppliers and so on. So there, and I remember Apple, another one that announced that they had a 36 billion war chest when the Japanese earthquake happened to buy components. So for the first time, a lot of companies are starting to look very deep in the whole chain. Then 2 things are happening. I would say one is that because the risk starts to be so high, many companies are thinking about insourcing. So we have seen a lot of trend in the 90s and the 2000s about outsourcing. Now we see both of them at the same time. Before it was referred as controlling the supply chain, when it's interesting, the chairman from Nestle saying, we want to control that. Somebody said, it was Lenin who said, trust is good, but control is better. So what you try to do is actually to control that, and you see a lot of this happening. The other thing that we see happening also, I think, is nearshoring. There was a lot of talk about offshoring. We saw that about nearshoring. It's not only because of that, it's also because the effects of the disruptions is creating such an effect. I won't mention which company, but some companies already 2-4 years ago, they were talking about de-risking China. The idea of saying I'm an electronic company, I'm too reliant on China, is not that I don't want to work in China, is that I need to spread the risks. So I think that we see these several things happening. So there's a lot of, I would say, much more concern about risk. And the problem is that we don't understand risk very well. There has been a lot of talking about risk from a point of view of intellectually, how do we do that? But from the actual making of it, most companies say we have a very good identification and plans to minimize the risk, but we are not able to follow up. Risks change over time, and we are not able even to talk about the business risk. It was Victor Funk who was talking about forecasting and so on. That's the typical business risk that we have dealt with in operations. What we see today is that companies are saying a supply chain that we optimize We don't know if it's going to be the right one in 1 year from now or even 6 months from now. I always mention the fact that to something like raw materials like powder milk, they go up and down 50% in value in 6 months. So a supply chain that you set up that was the right one 6 months ago now is totally wrong. So many companies are trying to control and to basically extend this control to minimize this uncertainty. In business, in general, we hate uncertainty. We want stability of prices. If you think about the last 20 years, we have been trained in an environment of stable prices. In the last 2 years, it has gone off the wall. We have no idea. And just to give you the last thing, I got a company asking me something that I thought academics we should be able to answer. There was a company producing aluminum, and a couple of years ago they told me, Carlos, how do we allocate product to customers? And I said, wait a minute, what do you mean? They say, oh, we have more demand than supply. Well, economics will tell you, raise the prices. Yeah, we did that twice already. We still have more demand than supply. So I went back to my academic papers. I found one paper, the last paper published about that, 1958. Some of you have software, SAP, and so on. There is a lot about how to supply and to satisfy demand. There is nothing about the other way around. So we are in a different world. And suppliers now are, in many cases, in the driving seat. So this idea about exceeding customer expectations, delighting customers we have always thought about, now is the idea about, well, which customers do you fire? And how do you select whom to serve? So it's a very different world.
So 4 very interesting cuts on the dynamics of the supply chain, I think the productivity point, and really thinking about what's happening in the units themselves. The product to service and how that's a constant driver. Charlie's reminder of the yin and yang between innovation and the supply chain, which is going to be a large-scale change. And then Carlos with how do you re-optimize against all of these changes in the supply chain itself. So that should give us food for questions. What I'd like to do is take 3 or 4 questions, depending upon how complicated they are, and then let the panel take a shot at those, and then we'll do that round another 1 or 2 times. So questions, comments from the audience? No one? I'm sure the panel can continue, but there must be something out of one of these 4 pieces of the dynamics of the supply chain. Yes?
Hi. We have a question with regards to the last...
The microphone's coming.
My name is Jerry Matos from Bain & Company. With regards to the last point about insourcing, do you also see companies and organizations bringing the make versus buy decisions back up onto the surface again? Because we've seen those going, very much extreme to the buy in the last couple of decades. Do you think these sort of decisions coming a lot more into on the table right now? We're making investment decisions, and as a result, also going a lot more vertical integration. What's your view on that, or the panel?
Okay, so we'll save that. We'll get that in a couple more.
Great.
But is there a changing balance, coming back to thinking about the make and not
Yes.
always just buy?
Exactly.
Excellent.
Exactly.
We'll give the panel time to think about that one. Yes, Senator.
Thank you very much for the very engaging comments. I'm Leonie Fung from Janker Partners. I was struck by the difference in view shared by Marjorie on, keeping production in China, because it seemed to contrast with the view shared by the previous panel where Dr. Fung was talking about production, some companies moving production away from China to OECD countries. I was trying to get more color as to why the differences in views, or maybe I'm missing some nuances. Maybe both panels have the same view, but it's just some nuances that I'm missing. Thank you.
Okay, so more color on the question of is China here to stay in a sense? As a
and also, as we read, labor costs are increasing as much as 30–40% each year. How can that be sustained in terms of China being, having the benefits of lower production compared to other regions? Thanks.
Let's take one more, and then we'll run it up and down the panel. So one more, yeah, up here, second row, or Patrick.
It's Patrick Steinem from Bank of America. I haven't heard the word globalizing in any of your speeches, maybe because it's an old thing. So let me ask the opposite, localizing supply chain in China. For example, we will see a development of two sorts of supply chains, the global OEMs who become local and bring their suppliers, and the local OEMs who have their local suppliers. What do you see in differences evolving in this localization development?
Okay, so completing the loop back to China, and who's going to do it and how? Will it be the outsiders who come back or the Chinese who go forward? So we've got three interesting questions. Who wants to begin? You can volunteer. You can pick on one of those. Volunteer. Okay.
Can we get rid of all the Li and Feng people in this room?
They can just cover their ears. No.
Hey, Li and Feng is my biggest customer. Have to be very, very careful, very tactful. So, because I don't want to disagree with Victor. I agree with, so let me start by saying I agree with Victor, but let me just add another, a little slightly different possible option. The make versus buy. Well, we have Don started by saying that we have a very long supply chain, and one of the reasons is that we have a lot of opportunity for innovation. As Hao Li says, we're actually not just in the business of manufacturing, we're in the service business. In fact, for Escal, a lot of our value add is in service. So what do? Now, Hugo Boss came to us and said, we want you to design a very classical looking men's knit shirt in black. Okay, that's a tricky one. But we're a spinner. Because we're a spinner, we've got expertise who said, change the twist in the yarn. Now, we made the special yarn. The very classic cut black knit shirt has a totally different feel. So if you're making the opportunities for the ability to innovate is a lot greater, because the permutations, you understand the permutations and possibilities in the whole process a lot better than if you're buying. And I think that is because, and that's I think why Li and Feng uses us so much, is because they're not using us just to make the product. They're using us from, to develop a lot of products. That's why a lot of customers are now coming to us. And I think in the U.S., this is, when the U.S. is bringing back manufacturing to the U.S., I think a lot of it is driven by the fact that you need some manufacturing to have innovation. So an in-depth understanding, and some of it, there are two kinds of innovation. One comes from a broad sweep, a change in the macro environment or in the technology. Another kind of innovation, it comes from an in-depth understanding of the process. So this is an opportunity. You have to be sitting on top of it to be able to come up with that kind of innovation. So that's my answer.
Great.
I think to answer the question about make, buy, and whether we should continue to manufacture in China or localizing the supply chain, one thought that I want to add to the table is that oftentimes some innovative companies have found that they can decompose the process, decompose the complete supply chain process, and some process steps may stay in China, and some do not have to stay in China. Some process steps we still retain in-house, and some we can do outsource. Some will do nearshore, and some will offshore. So I think that answer to the question of whether we do make buy or in-house, offshore, or onshore, it's not a simple answer, because you can innovate through process decomposition. That's what Hewlett-Packard has been doing. Hewlett-Packard's printers used to be manufactured in China, and then they customize and localize the product, and they discover that the cost of China is rising, and the container freight cost is rising, and the tariffs are rising. So what they did is that they also do not want to leave China, because China is still most productive and have the manufacturing know-how. So what they did is they manufacture the core products in China, and then they customize, postponed and customize the product now in Eastern Europe for the European market, and then they do the nearshoring, as Carlos has mentioned, of customizing the product in Mexico, Guadalajara, for North America. So in that sense, they're using a combination approach. They're neither leaving China nor staying in China. So, but they leave the core manufacturing in China, and then the customization step near shore. So I think this may be something to think about, is to not look at that as a 0-1 decision or yes-no decision, but a clever combination solution may be the one that would be most effective.
Clever combination, but it's partly moving the packages, but as Margie says, it's also partly changing what is inside of each package, right? So it's changing the productivity in the process within a structure and moving the pieces.
Yeah. So I want to build on that. First, what happened to vertical integration, and why has it all been by for the last 10 years? I don't think it has been. 10 years ago, I was doing a lot of work with Nokia, and we visited one of their suppliers, Foxconn, and Foxconn had a banner that they put up for the Nokia people when they arrived, and it said, the solution to supply chain management is vertical integration. That is, we'll do everything for you. We, Foxconn, are highly vertically integrated. So did vertical integration go away? I don't think so. What was the last corporate act of Steve Jobs? His last corporate act, last thing he did before he died, and he knew he was going to die, was to go before the city board in Cupertino to get permission to build a single building to house 12,000 Apple workers in one place. That's integration. That's integral. Jobs felt it was critically important that all 12,000 of those people work in the same site because he wants them to interact with each other, because the integrality and the connectivity in that part of the supply chain is critical to him. Now, at the same time, he uses Foxconn for manufacturing. So building on Hal's point, you have some parts that are modular, and you say, okay, we'll put our manufacturing in Foxconn in China, but some parts that are integral, and we have to have all 12,000 of these people under the same roof. So did vertical integration ever go away? No. Has outsourcing ever gone away? No. One has to be selective, and one has to have, in some sense, some subtlety to one's strategy about what do I need to do inside, what do I need to do outside, where do I want to be integral, and where do I want to be modular. And I think the third question about what's global and what's local is a similar kind of a story. For what functions do I need to be geographically close, and for what functions do I not need to be geographically close? And same story with organizationally close, culturally close, electronically close. You can think about closeness of elements in the supply chain on multiple dimensions. And so supply chain design is trying to decide, figuring out which parts of the supply chain have to be close on which dimensions and which ones can be separate. And so Esquel has a certain strategy leveraging the fact that you can build more value by putting some things together and not chasing the lowest labor costs every time costs move a little bit, because you can get more value by keeping things together and being much more integral.
Yeah, building on what the previous panelists, Charlie and how Marjorie said, let me add a couple of twists to that. Make versus buy. I think that the question traditionally was a question of looking at cost, then it became a little bit of a kind of a strategic question. Today, what I find is that you go to the board level of companies for them to try to understand that. Let me explain a couple of things that happened to me. I remember precisely working with Nokia. They were asking me to teach the purchasing people about business models, and I said, what the hell are you talking about? And they said, our business model is changing dramatically. 70 to 80% of our income goes directly to our suppliers. If they don't know how these decisions are affecting the whole strategy, we are nowhere. So at the same time, I got the Finnish Association of CEOs asking me to teach them about supply chain, because they said, we are changing our strategy. And again, 70%, 80% of our revenue goes out to the supply chain. So what I would say is that supply chain has been regarded in many companies as a kind of functional specialization or as a kind of specialization. Companies have been, I would say, flabbergasted by the example of Fu and Ling and by the example of fast fashion companies like Inditex, Zara, and Desigual, saying, wow, they have changed the industry. But in general, there's not a lot of understanding about supply chain among the top people. And for the first time, they are saying, our whole strategy, 80% of it is depending on that. So there is a rephrasing, I would say. At top level, there is a kind of trying to learn. The second one, which is about globalization, localization, you were saying, I think that Charlie put it very rightly. Vertical integration has not gone back, but for many companies, they thought that by just having the brand, this is the value added, and we outsource the rest. And there is a huge economy, there's a huge synergy across the value chain that it has been lost. The name of the game in outsourcing has been economies of scale. We go to big factories to try to have economies of scale. We go to China to have huge factories. Some companies, big companies, are saying economies of scale are out. What does that mean? That means that now there is much more about what is the synergies of having different steps in the supply chain integrated. Which goes back a little bit to the competitiveness of China. China has a great internal market. That means if there is a game in which China is extending its economies of scale, and then just a little bit to be a little bit provocative to Marjorie, I'm Spanish. So we have a very great company in Spain, one of the few that we have, which is called Zara. And they are exactly in the other game. They are in the game of producing short series and reacting very fast. And it's interesting, it's another example, and everybody contrasts Li and Fung versus Zara. And it's interesting that they have built a great company, not based on economies of scale, but based on what is called now fast fashion. And now you have Uniqlo and H&M and everybody copying that. The interesting thing for me is that they have a very local supply chain. The one that is highly value added is local. So are we going to see now the emergence of a lot of value added supply chains following that model? And the interesting thing to me is that I think that we're going to see much more localization than globalization that we have seen in the past.
Great, thank you. Some more questions from the audience. We'll do another round. Yes, right here. Third row.
Yes, my name is Ting Ho from Symphony Holdings out in Hong Kong here. Okay. Now, one of the things that we experience is e-commerce, electronic commerce, the purchasing methods, the people retailing business has changed. And in the US, the same way the channels, some are closing down, consolidating, and fragmenting. So how would this, the new technology and also processes would be able to reduce the kind of uncertainty for a distributor, for the brand manager like ourselves?
So will it reduce it, or it could in fact exacerbate it? Right? So how will the new customer-facing technologies change things? Okay.
Thank you.
Another? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, just a quick question. I mean, I work for the United Nations ESCAP, and what we are dealing with is analyzing the impact of natural disasters. And Asia, the Pacific region, is the region which has been the most affected by these natural disasters, from tsunamis to floodings to earthquakes, you name it. This is, of course, heavily impacting supply chains. How do businesses deal with that? I mean, on the one hand, they're increasing vertical integration. On the other hand, there is still a need for outsourcing. But this, when we talk about risk, this is really a big issue that you cannot predict. How do businesses deal with that when they manage the supply chain?
Great. I might go back to the panel at this point then, because we have two very important, quite different questions. So one of them is kind of e-commerce and the disruption there and how it changes the whole chain. And then now that you have all of this wonderful thing built, what about the increasing frequency of natural disasters and what that implies? So two disruptors of the existing structure. I don't know who wants to begin. Anyone? Yeah.
Well, the first one about e-commerce, it's I will use again the example of the fashion industry. It's very interesting. Until I would say 2-3 years ago, there were only two companies successful in e-commerce in fashion. One was Victoria's Secret, and the other was a European company called La Redoute. Basically, both used to be catalog business, and what they did was to put the catalog on the internet. That was it. All the rest were not successful. I remember Mango, H&M, not successful. 2 or 3 years ago, suddenly the world changed. and now something like 20% of the sales in fashion in many of these companies go through the internet. The impact in supply chain has been tremendous because the consumer behaves in a very strange way. For them, it was a surprise. They realized that the number of returns through the supply chain is something like 50%. Consumers buy and they return much more than they were used to do in the normal chain. So for many of them, the supply chain has been a total disaster. They need to be adapted. So in that sense, I think that we will see a lot of changes in the supply chain, and if anything, we'll see much more increase of transport, which is one of the issues that were mentioned. So that's a little bit what I can add about e-commerce. I would like also to add that for years, we have predicted a lot of things. For years, it never happened. So any prediction is very difficult to trust. The second about how business deal with all these events, they are learning. There is a lot of companies, at least I found a lot of companies, particularly in Europe, that they were affected by things like the ice cloud and all these things, that suddenly they started to look at that. And the interesting thing is there are two things. There are the global multinationals. They are trying precisely now to look at creating supply chains that they can react to these kind of events. They don't know what they are. It's the first time they are putting that on the top of the table. That means, as Victor Fung was talking about, double sourcing, a lot of things, and resilience of supply chain. At the same time, there is a lot of interest in trying to understand how do we react as an opportunity. So some supply chain companies, some transport companies are looking at that as, can we offer to our customers a way to react to this? So it's a very Chinese reaction of saying every risk is an opportunity. So what you will see is that you will see even consulting companies talking about dynamic supply chains and things like that, about how to deal with risk. So some businesses are really considering that, and others are creating business based on that.
Okay, I guess I'll take on the e-commerce one first. So I have two reactions. One is that's the innovation story. It's going to lead to volatility and destruction, and get used to it. Right? That you seem to be asking, gee, how can I reduce the uncertainty from the innovation of e-commerce? I think the answer is it's not going to happen that way. It's going to be that as you get more innovation, you're going to get more disruption, more change. You're going to get new supply chains and dismantling of some old supply chains. So I think that's one piece of the story. The other piece, just more specifically on e-commerce, this thing about when people order over the internet, they didn't get to try it on, and so therefore they return it more frequently. I think mobile e-commerce may be reversing that somewhat. So literally someone goes in the store, they try it on, but then they order it from Amazon.com or somebody else right off their mobile phone, and so they've already tried it on, and they know they're not going to return it, and so the mobile e-commerce in some sense undoes some of that return problem. On the disasters, I think of the disasters as falling into two camps. One is disruption of commercial supply chains, and the other one is humanitarian supply chains. And I think it was the latter that you were more focused on, or not necessarily? The first. Oh, so more of the disruption. So I think Carlos dealt with that well, and Hao knows the humanitarian better than I anyway, so.
I think one comment about the e-commerce is that the emergence of e-commerce may result in we throwing away our common understanding of what's efficient in the supply chain. I was struck by what Zappos, the founder, has told me one time. As you know, Zappos is a shoe company that you can buy online, and they were so successful that even Amazon could not compete with them successfully, so that eventually Amazon have to buy them. Yeah, that's the way. If you cannot compete with the competitor, well, you just buy them. And Zappos says that in the past, they thought that returns would be bad. So companies said that companies would focus on what can we do to reduce returns. And what Zappos said is that the people who returned the most were their most valuable customers. The customers who returned all the time were the one who would buy a lot from them. And so, in fact, they said they encourage returns. And so they would do everything to make it easy for you to return. So I think one of the insight that I gained is that in the world of e-commerce, it could be quite different from the traditional channels, so that we have to maybe throw away some of our common understanding or the traditional understanding. On the disasters, companies need to develop resilient supply chain, and I think a colleague of Charlie Yossi Sheffy has written a book about it. And the essence of the book really is to, I'm not just doing justice in summarizing the whole book in 1 minute, yeah. But the key is to develop this ability to be flexible. And the flexibility has to be at multiple levels. It starts with design flexibility. What can we do so that the design can be changed quickly to respond? Second is manufacturing flexibility. Third is supply flexibility, so that it's multi-sourcing, backup supplies, logistics flexibility, because sometimes you do not have enough of the containers to go out and in of the country, and that became the constraint. And finally, the ability to influence demand shaping. Because sometimes you can influence demand in such a way so that it avoid the demand coming out of the disaster area or the disaster-struck supply sources. So it's building some flexibility at multi-levels, perhaps are ways to reduce the impact of a disaster that happened to your supply chain.
Let me start with e-commerce, and I'm surprised to hear what Hao is saying, because we've been monitoring e-commerce, because in China that's a huge, very fast-growing sector. In fact, I just did some work on analyzing Vanco, and one of the problems that Vanco is facing is high number of rejects and returns. But I think there's a cost element, because the per value per order is very low. So that return it's going to kill them. We've had a lot of experience with servicing catalog houses, and it's always been, I've been taught quality. That's the key. Consistent quality. Now, that's what we're very strong in. And in fact, Zara is also one of our customers. So you can even see that even Zara, they have certain products where they want that stability of quality. So that's an area that we're very keen to develop for, because e-commerce demands, in fact, a very high standard of quality from the vendor. Disappointment, you don't go back. So on risk management, we have factories in Vietnam, we have factories in Sri Lanka, etc. Initially, it's because of quota, and now we're keeping those because possible trade conflicts. If there happens with China, Sino-US trade disputes, it's a possibility. We've always been very concerned about when we had SARS. We had to do a lot to split up the work and try to have backup in every possible way, and also chop our production into units, whether it is in the same factory. We've always been thinking about how we can chop up our textile manufacturing, which has the fabric mill. It has a lot of economy of scale, so it's difficult to chop up and have in different locations. So that's something that we're constantly thinking of, and that's why we're always very interested in the history of the flood in the Pearl River Delta, because we're near one of the tributaries and we're very concerned. So that's something that we look at continuously, but we cannot find a completely satisfactory solution.
Excellent. Oh, sorry. Okay, more questions? We're doing very well here in questions and responses. Must be more. Have we exhausted all of the issues? Yes, Mukhtar. Up here we need a microphone in the front row, and then, okay, there, and then we'll go to the second row, and great.
I'm sorry if this has been covered, but recently there was on the cover of The Economist about the third industrial revolution with digital printing and the like. How do you think this is going to change fundamentally traditional supply chain? I know this is lots of prediction and whatever else, but
industrial revolution, low-scale manufacturing, a whole bunch of things.
No, well, there's at one level more technology, including some really revolutionary technology,
Okay, good. That's one. Yes, second row.
Yes, Annette Clayton from Schneider Electric. My question was really on managing risk, and one of the risk areas we haven't really talked much about is talent. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts around maybe some innovation you're seeing in some of your work around talent, especially as we see really a shift even in the leadership of many of our local supply chains to local talent.
Let's take one more. Is there one more question? Or shall we? Let's go with those two. So those, again, are quite different. So risk, but now in terms of talent and the balances or imbalances in that, and the other, another source of disruption, which would be new manufacturing technologies. Charlie, do you want to start off in the you're a disruption guy, right? That's your. Here, take a. Yeah.
So I think the 3D printing possibility is actually quite exciting, and I actually thought I'm going to go out and buy one of those things for my kids and teach them how to make anything. We have a course at MIT called How to Make Almost Anything, and it's taught by a professor in the Media Lab, Neil Gershenfeld, and he has what he calls the Fab Lab, and the Fab Lab is a relatively small set of machines, and he takes students into his course and says we can make anything in the Fab Lab. And not only has he built a Fab Lab at MIT, but there are about several dozen Fab Labs around the world, including some in India, some in China, and he's basically trying to enable people in any part of the world to make anything that they need. Anything. You need a spare part, you need a shirt, you need whatever you need, you can make it in the Fab Lab, and the Fab Lab is a relatively cheap invention, all right? Goodbye global supply chains, right? The only thing you have to ship overseas is the electronic code, the instruction to the machine of what to make, and then you're there, right? So saves a lot on transportation costs. Once you ship the Fab Lab, you don't have to ship materials anymore. So I think the possibility of significant disruption from make anything anywhere is very exciting. It will create value, but it will destroy supply chains, and we shall see how it'll evolve. But I wouldn't bet against it.
From Margie Smile, I see some possible response here.
Okay. This is the MIT guys. So, you forgot to say that it's also in Hong Kong. I'm council chair of Hong Kong PolyU, and we think we've got more 3D printers than the Media Lab and all of MIT. In fact, Victor spent quite a bit. Victor Fung took many people from Lian Fung over last week, just promoting PolyU a little bit here. Now, I thought about that, so I got Peter Schwartz from MIT to give me a quote on a 3D printed shirt that you can wear. That you can wear. You can even wear. If you give me an order, I will have it made for you. 20,000 US.
There'll be a market, I'm sure. People want $20,000 shirts.
Yeah, I think there is. I think there is a market for but I think the opportunities are in really the product development side, and a lot of opportunity, and we're really looking into digitizing the entire product development cycle as much as possible. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in using digital technology. I'm not sure it's going to stop sewing yet, but tremendous opportunity.
Can I rebut?
Yes.
How much did you pay for your mobile phone 25 years ago when you bought your first one, and how much did you pay now? Per CPU cycle.
Now that's why I'm very keen to pursue this. I've got Peter actually making that, so I'm really interested to see how we can move with that. Because there are also other. There's also the issue of how does it feel? Because we tried. This comes to a question. Because we're in the men's market, men are a lot more demanding. For women, hear me out. Women, if we look good in something, we will put up with the discomfort. Men are a lot more difficult because they want to look good, but they also want to feel good, right? If you can't sweat in your shirt, comfortably, you don't want to wear it. So there are a lot of, we're very interested, but I think we've got quite a bit of challenge. So, but having said that, there's also synthetic biology. There's a lot of development in biology that could also be offer disruptive opportunities there. So we in fact agree.
We agree.
We agree.
So any more on the disruptive manufacturing technologies?
Yeah. I'll just add one more example of how these type of new disruptive technologies can make a difference. And it actually is related to my earlier point about some companies that were purely manufacturing company or product-based company, and they transformed themselves to be a much more service-based company. The Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, TSMC, that purely was definitely a manufacturing company because they are a fab, right? They make wafer fabrication for their customers. But what they discover is that if they are able to create a computer simulation that would simulate the manufacturing of a product, then some of the customers do not have to make a prototype of the maskings in their fabrication. So in the design phase, masks are very expensive. Each prototype can cost $50,000 all the way to $1 million for just a mask of a prototype. But if you can digitize it, then it costs almost nothing. That you can do multiple iterations to improve the design before you physically manufacture the product. And that was a tremendous value add to their customers. So that's a particular service here. On the talent thing, I actually agree with you that the SEM World did a survey last year, and they discovered that this is one of the most critical problem faced by supply chain executives, the chief supply chain officers. And the reason why supply chain talents are so difficult to retain or to get is mainly because the so-called supply chain people are no longer easy, simple supply chains that we're dealing with. So my very good friend Corey Billington, that used to be a professor at IMD, he was a vice president of procurement for Hewlett-Packard. And he says that used to be at Hewlett-Packard, if you want to be an executive in procurement, it's very simple. You just look for the lowest cost seller, and then you buy from them, and they give them the best quote as long as they meet the quality standard, delivery schedule, and that's good. But now procurement is a portfolio manager. You almost have to learn financial options to understand completely how to manage a portfolio. And so I think that's the complexity of the need that drive it, and the mobility of those people. And so I think some companies have taken the approach of doing much more in-house training. So of course, as a professor, I always would encourage them to do so by creating training programs and then hire professors to come in and do those training. Right. That, by the way, is what Li and Feng is doing. And both Charlie and I are helping Li and Feng to do the internal training. So we do need to invest in the talent pool because the job is so much more complicated these days.
Carlos.
Let me build on that. One of the things that, and I'm going to add a very different twist on the new technologies in manufacturing. I live in a country called Switzerland. And it was interesting, we had a conference a couple of months ago about manufacturing in Switzerland. I mean, you can think about who on earth is going to manufacture in such an expensive country. Well, you might be surprised to know that after Germany, Switzerland is the country with the highest manufacturing base in Europe. And you can think about watches and so on. Now, the interesting thing is that this is what I call emotional manufacturing. Victor, I know somebody else was referring to, it's good sometimes to have something made in Italy. It has a value for the consumer. The issue is, if we look at manufacturing, we are going far away from mass manufacturing to much more niche. I always use an example as Audi. I remember 10 years ago, Audi had basically three models, the A4, A6, and A8. Now they have the A0, A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, A6, A7, Q3, Q5. So if anything, we are increasing the complexity and the number of products that we make of the same are much smaller. That's what we see. And I think some of these new technologies are going to allow the development of that, of this exclusivity in that sense. And this is why I use the watch industry. The watch industry is one of the big users, and it's very traditional, but at the same time they're looking at all this technology to develop that. So we may see basically there a development because the consumer is driving much more towards unique products. And the second part about the talent risk is, to me was a surprise a little bit like for how I'm the director of a forum at IMD called the Value Chain 2020. We have 10 companies, everybody is specialized looking in supply chain. And one of the areas they wanted us to do research was precisely about leadership in supply chains. Is building on what Howe said about being complex, there is another aspect which becomes much more difficult, which is typically these people is supposed to work across the organization. So if you think about finance people, they work in finance. You think about marketing, they work in marketing. You think about supply chain, they need to coordinate finance people and marketing people and outside people. So from a leading point of view, from a leadership point of view, it's something amazing. Think about that. I'm an engineer. Most supply chain people come as an engineering background. Engineers were extremely bad, and I talk about myself, are leading different people if they are not engineers. We believe that anybody who's not an engineer, they don't have a right to live. And then basically what happens is that suddenly you need to coordinate people who is thinking in different ways. And that creates a huge challenge. From a leadership point of view, is huge. That means, and that's one of the weakest points today of many people in supply chain, you need to lead across functions. So that means you need to have people who has a business view. And that's very difficult. And on top of that, many people like that is not attracted to supply chain.
It's interesting how on the talent answer you both picked up, or all of you picked up on the talent required to manage the supply chain. But I think you were also pointing to the supply chain as a talent chain, right? And how do you, we're moving product, but frankly, we're moving talent at the end of the day. And where is the talent, and how does that get upstream, either through product or service? So maybe a bigger question.
That was how I interpreted your question, thinking more about the talent in your supply chain. And I think that gets to the globalization, localization, the Margie's issues as well, is that do you want to chase the cheapest labor you can find, in which case you're not investing in talent, you're investing in the cheap labor, or do you want to build capability and capacity in your people, and that means you have to stay still. It means you can't chase the cheapest labor in the world. It means you stay put, and you win through productivity improvement, not through low labor costs. And I think that's the story that you're basically telling it. And I think you look at a company like Toyota, obviously they've gone in the direction of we're going to build capability. You look at a company like Li and Fung, and they've got a challenge, right? Because historically they've had to compete on cost and be where the low labor costs are. Increasingly, I think they're beginning to feel the great tensions of trying to chase that. Do we move on from China to Bangladesh to Vietnam to Burma, or do we stay put and follow more of this strategy? And if you do, that means you have to begin investing in your people in a very different way, build loyalty, build capability, win through productivity, but you still have to compete against the other guys who are going to chase the cheap labor. Not an easy game.
You're allowed. Am I allowed? Sure, you're allowed. Albert produced all of these posters. Albert has been doing a lot of the background work on the supply chain in FGI, so you're allowed.
Thanks. So all the mistakes are mine as well. Sorry, my name's Albert. I'm actually from FGI, as Donna just mentioned. And I mean, I figured in terms of the perspective for this panel, Carlos, you had mentioned that we're looking at a lot of risks, and as you had mentioned, that they're also fundamentally considered opportunities. So if we're taking a look at it from the firm perspective, and we're trying to evaluate where the risks and the opportunities are, and if we combine those two, let's just call them change, I'd be very interested in seeing from each of your relative perspectives whether you anticipate or whether you see any significant changes that will affect the world of supply chains in the near future, and if there's anything in particular that you have a passion or a serious interest or curiosity in, and something that maybe would pertain to the supply chain practitioners and just keeping an eye on. Yeah,
so up to your top 3, not your top 10, but your top 3.
That's a good idea.
Let me refer to a conversation that a couple of weeks ago we had Charlie and myself in my office. Some of these companies that work in this forum, they raised one question that it's very difficult for me to answer. I asked Charlie because I thought that he will be able to answer. He thought, I didn't thought too much about that either, which is the relation between risk and speed. If you think about that, and I use the example of fashion because it's an interesting one, you could conceptualize the idea of fast fashion as saying, by being much faster, we reduce the risk of the typical business risk because we don't need to forecast so much. Typical answer is, and that was also how Lee who developed that idea of, if you can be much faster, that means you don't need effectively to forecast and to see what is coming. Now the same is about risks. Can we react much faster? Is this valuable or not? And then in some cases you find some companies saying, I remember working with Shell, Shell was saying, yeah, absolutely, for us, our calculation of net present value is an easy one. Some people were saying, well, in the pharma industry, we might need to use the option theory and Monte Carlo simulation to put that value. But there's a general question. Do we see value on that? Because in some cases, speed is more expensive. Is that an insurance policy against risk? So that's one of the first topics I see. The second, which is going to be interesting to see what's going to happen is, and it's dealt in another forum, is I see the biggest lever, and it was mentioned yesterday also, about sustainability in supply chains. And let me explain you why. I was invited by a company called Unilever to their Suppliers' Day. That was in Trondheim Stadium last year in the UK. Now, they had hundreds of suppliers over there, and they told them, we want you to reduce that much CO2 by that date and by this time. Now, in one go, you get hundreds of suppliers not thinking if they want to do it, but saying, our customer is asking to do it, so we have no choice. If not, they won't work with us. So I think that there is going to be a very interesting thing about is people in supply chain having the biggest leverage there, and they could do that. And the third thing, I think I will pass on the third. I think that these two are the most important ones.
So I guess my forecast for supply chain managers is it's going to get harder. that I think, building on the speed thought, is the speed of change going to get any slower? Well, what drives speed of change? Well, I think one of the things is technological innovation. That is, most of your supply chains run 24/7 and your BlackBerries and iPhones never stop updating you because of technological innovation. The global supply chains are more global because of technological innovation. Technological innovation drives speed of change and integration, and it's not slowing down, the technological innovation, apropos the comments earlier about 3D printing and those kinds of things. Another thing that drives speed of change is competition. And competition is driven partly by globalization. If you have globalization, then any firm in the world is competing with many, many other firms around the world. You're not just competing with your few local competitors, you're competing with a large number of global suppliers. Globalization continues to increase because of airplanes, because of internet. It seems to be a pretty irreversible process. So globalization is going to create more competition. That's going to speed things up. Technological innovation is going to speed things up. Life is not going to get simpler for supply chain managers.
Okay. Can you cheer us up a bit, Hal?
I just want to mention that there is something called the AAA supply chain concepts, right? AAA stands for the first A being agility, the second A being adaptability, and the third A is alignment. And I think, Albert, when we are faced with risks, the 3A concept seems to be quite applicable to me. And the first one is being agility. And Carlos has mentioned that maybe sometimes speed, agility, flexibility is one way for us to both reduce risk as well as being able to respond to some of the unexpected disruptions faster. So it really elevates the importance of agility and perhaps even the clock speed of agility, using the term that Charlie has used in his book. The second, adaptability, is as there are more risks and there are more changes, it means that we just have to be even more alert about how to adapt your supply chain. And Carlos mentioned about the success of a company, Inditex. And Inditex used to manufacture 90% in Spain and Portugal. But over the years, they also recognized the need to adapt their supply chain. And the latest I learned is that now 60% of the manufacturing is based in China. So they also adapt, even though their kind of core strategy is local manufacturing. And so adaptation is necessary. And how do you adapt well, and what do you adapt to, became a much bigger problem. And the third A, alignment, is when we have risks, no single company can perhaps shoulder all the risks. So we may have to design new supply contracts and incentive systems so that the right risk-sharing schemes and the right reward sharing too. Of course, risk sharing has to be commensurate with reward sharing, cost sharing schemes are necessary to align the incentives of the multiple supply chain partners in order for us to really have a synchronized supply chain. So it seems to me that the AAA concept is really at the core of risk management and be responsive to risk in the supply chain.
Good, thank you. Margie.
That's scary. That's such a men's view. Triple A, able, amiable, and available. And I think that I'm going to close by taking this from a woman's perspective on the global supply chain and say that it's very scary because I think very often the global supply chain looks at the supply chain from a buyer's market perspective. And it's sort of like, love me and leave me. It's very scary. So I think we have a responsibility to the communities where the workers are doing all the work and supplying to consumers everywhere. I think it is critical that as managers, we have the foresight of anticipating these disruptions that will definitely come. Whether it is because of good news, economic growth, therefore a higher standard of living. Penang, as you know, we're struggling with. How do we anticipate all sudden disruptions from technology? It's all going to come. So our responsibility is to have the supply chain of talent raise the overall ability of the people who are contributing to the supply chain so that they can fit in to the changes. And I think that's the challenge and responsibility for all of us in the global supply chain.
Excellent ending point, and I'd just like to stress that within the supply chain studies in FGI, clearly we're interested in risk from the viewpoint of buyers, but very much risk from the viewpoint of the people doing the work, and risk from the entrepreneurs who are making the investments in the pieces of the chain. And to broaden it out from just, will you get the stuff out at the right price, what happens to the people who have committed themselves to work in a particular place, committed themselves to learn some skills, committed themselves to build a factory. So it's commitment against this uncertainty, and how does one align the incentives and get some equity in this total commitment. So I hope we'll elevate it one level from just how do you manage the supply chain to how do you think about the supply chain as a central integrating device in how we all live. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists. I would very much like to thank the excellent questioners, and I think we're on time. Thank you.
Still